Guys, do you remember when we had those videos talking about the difficulty of this raid? We went over how, statistically speaking, the 4th boss of this raid, Styx, was the hardest ever, and then we actually doubled up on moving on to the 6th boss, One Arm Bandit, also being the hardest 6th boss ever, all the while the world first guilds were getting very heavily walled on Magzi. So the progression looked to be very hard in the prospect of a 3, possibly 400 pulls last boss of this raid tier. And then of course there was sort of the downer of Gallywix being quite the joke. However, since then, it's been basically a month and a half, the outlook on the difficulty of this raid has definitely changed, you know. Let's have a quiz. In these past 3 expansions dating back to Shadowlands, which raids at this point in time, at the beginning of the 7th week of the tier, so 6 weeks after the release of the raid, which raids had more kills of the last boss than Liberation of Undermine, which at the moment is sitting at 129. You get all 30 points if you answered correctly, and that is Aberus with 220 and Sanctum of Domination with Sylvanas having 233 kills. However, all of the other ones have been harder up to this point. So Castle Natria, Sepulchre, Vault of the Incarnates, Amirdrasil and Nerobar Palace as well have all had fewer last boss kills than this raid. This entire preamble is perhaps what justifies Blizzard in having nerfed more bosses this reset. And the nerfs were across the board. You had Styx that was nerfed in 17% less damage on Toxic Fumes, which is very relevant because Toxic Fumes is the #1 source of damage taken from players in this encounter. You had also Sprocket being nerfed, you had the Unstable Explosion damage reduced by 10%, and the first hit of the raid AoE, the Sonic Baboom, reduced by 4%, both of which are again very relevant because these are the 2 basically major sources of damage taken throughout the entire encounter. And then more importantly, you had much larger nerfs to both Magzi and Gallywix. Uncontrolled Burn and Elemental Calamity both being nerfed by 12%. Those are above 50% of the damage you are taking throughout the entire fight. So it is a very relevant nerf. Searing Shrapnel being reduced by 12% is also very relevant because it's the bomb absorb, so it makes it easier for you to not die as you have the absorb shield on you, because the bomb also does damage as long as the absorb shield still stays on you. And then the Surging Arc, which is the annoying ad zapping you, which could facilitate some players dying as they were dropping low from the already high raid damage while also being targeted by this ad. So it's practically almost a flat out 12% damage reduction across the board on this fight. The nerf on Gallywix, perhaps because also it's not nearly as tough of a boss, is also not nearly as big. Total Destruction being nerfed by 10%, the canisters, the absorb shield of the canisters being reduced by 10%, as well as the detonation damage, once the absorb goes away, reduced by 10%, the venting heat damage also reduced by 10%, you know, all of these combined were like 40-ish% of all of the raid damage you were taking in this fight. So the nerfs to Gallywix weren't nearly as big. But then again, as mentioned, Magzi was a much tougher boss for guilds to go through than Gallywix is, so it's understandable to have Magzi nerfed quite a bit more than Gallywix. Now, what happened in 2 different phases this week were the first hotfix changes to dungeons, which actually made dungeons harder. Now, a few of these were for better clarity. For example, now in Kultarok you have the orbs having a clear outline on the ground, so you actually know whenever you're getting actually clipped by these orbs. The same goes for the charge, the reckless delivery of the hobgoblins in Meadery. Now you actually know exactly where the charge is going. It's quite relevant, especially when you are not the one being targeted. In those corridors, sometimes there are 20 different mobs, you can't see anything. One of your party members is being targeted and you don't even notice it, and actually he's charging your way and you didn't even know. this is gonna make it much more clear to you. However, some of these fixes have also unintentionally nerfed the dungeons. The first of all is the first boss of Dark Flame Cleft, the high speed collision. The charge of the first boss can no longer hit mobs that aren't part of the encounter. This was used in, well, very high key levels, where players were taking the last couple of trash packs together with the boss and then putting them in the circles created by the charge, which would actually also damage them. Not just the minions spawning from the boss encounter, those circles of rocks falling from the ceiling was actually damaging any mob, which included other trash mobs, and this has now been fixed. The other fix, which has made the fight even harder, was the fix to throw Dark Flame in the third boss of Dark Flame Cleft, the Candle King. Now, Throw Dark Flame properly applies the healing absorb to all players. Well, this was basically just bugged. It would just not apply this absorb shield to the players to begin with, so it was just a missed mechanic. However, what players realized after these changes, especially with the Candle King, was the fact that this already tough healing check of a boss now became even harder. Now this was of course paired with the fact that the healer in that dungeon in high keys, being Discipline, had just been nerfed as well. So you had the combo of the boss being made harder with the healer being made weaker. So these are hot fixes, which means they should be already live in game for this Saturday. First of all, there is a reduction of the Throw Dark Flame of Candle King's health absorb by 20%. This is still making the boss harder than it was before. Harder than before this, this bug didn't even have the absorb shields to begin with. And still very hard, of course, at high levels, because the spec supposed to heal this encounter, Discipline, has been nerfed. So it's still kind of bad, and it still remains the toughest healing check encounter in the dungeon pool for this season. Much better changes, these are flat positive for Cinderbroom Meadery. The Yes Man, the 4 mobs inexplicably placed before the last boss, these health sponges with mechanics that would be fitting for a dungeon in vanilla, since these mobs do nothing, their health has been reduced by 10%. I would literally rather have 1 minute cut off the timer of Meadery if you just removed these mobs altogether. Much better change though is the hobgoblins no longer spawning brew drops on death. This is the major W in this dungeon. We have complained before, of course, about the myriad of spawns in this dungeon and the myriad of fodder in this dungeon, whether it is the patrons in the first room, or the bees on the right, or the brew drops on the left corridors. There's a ton of stuff clogging your screen. Now these no longer spawn. These are also very annoying because inexplicably they just wrecked the tank. Also, they had very fickle aggro, meaning that sometimes, most of the time, random DPS would get just 2 hit to death from these brew drops. They were just, in general, very annoying. Now, Workshop gets a bunch of changes. The biggest one is the change to Cujo. Now Cujo can no longer be hit during venting flames at a certain angle. The line of sight trickery that you could use to still damage the boss while hiding behind the crate. Now this is planned to be a net neutral change because Cujo's health has also been reduced by 10%. Now, looking at a log of damage done on this fight, you can see that, for example, during the exact window of the venting flames, this group is doing 125 million damage out of the boss HP pool in this fight of 1.37 billion. So they did 9% damage to the boss while behind the crate. So this is now no longer possible, so you lose this 9% damage, but the boss has 10% HP nerfed. The mixed feelings come when you consider specs having to now have downtime on the boss, because part of some of the advantages of being able to stick to the boss even while hiding behind the crate is the fact that you can keep hitting the boss, you can refresh your cooldowns or lower the CDR of some of your abilities, etc, etc, which is something that now you cannot do in this new version of the boss. So probably still will end up being somewhat even of a fix on this fight. It's just annoying because now you have players, 5 seconds having to stay just AFK doing nothing, which is just not very engaging gameplay. Lastly, you have nerfs to the Priory, well-deserved nerfs to the Priory. You have the Ardent Paladin's HP reduced by 6%, as well as Priory's Merprey's health reduced by 12.5%. You also have the War Lynx's health reduced by 20% and their pounce's impact damage, so not the dot left behind, just the initial hit of the pounce, reduced by 20%, as well as, finally, the Sharpshooter's pot shot cooldown has been doubled, increased by 100%. Quite a few annoying things being lessened here, going right side was very rarely done in Priory, which is the side where you had to deal with the War Lynxes, for example. I still think you won't go right side even with the War Lynxes nerfed. At least now they are less annoying. The Sharpshooters casting pot shot twice less often is very good, and then flat out less HP on the Ardent Paladins is also very good. So it is an overall nice nerf to Priory. This one, as mentioned, being an hotfix, is going to be already live, so there is no need to have a patch, there is no need to have a reset. This, as you log in the game, will have already been pushed through in Mythic Plus dungeons. So these have been the changes for this weekly reset, both the ones at the start of the reset, namely the nerfs to the raid bosses, and then these latest ones to the dungeons. In general, we are still talking more or less just about nerfs, which is always good. It's always nice to have them be made somewhat easier overall. So with this out of the way, we can now call it quits on this Saturday. We are starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I don't know. I slept almost 7 hours today, but I feel like I got cheated on. I feel like it's much less because I'm a bit more tired than what I should be.